Sometimes the man everyone calls a hero is the first one put in handcuffs. The first scream inside Brookdale Mall didn't sound like panic at first. It sounded like confusion, the kind of sharp, startled noise people make when something ordinary suddenly turns wrong. And within seconds, shoppers who had been carrying coffee cups and shopping bags just moments earlier were backing away from the center corridor, where a young woman stood frozen near a fallen display rack, her hands trembling. Her eyes locked on a scene she didn't fully understand yet, because standing between her and the danger she had barely noticed was a tall black man in a gray jacket, breathing hard but steady, his posture calm in a way that didn't match the chaos spreading around him as security alarms began echoing through the polished hallways and parents pulled their children closer while phones came out and whispers turned into questions no one could answer fast enough. The man didn't run, didn't shout, didn't even look around for attention. He simply stepped back once, carefully, as if making space for everyone else to move first. And that was the moment the sirens arrived. They came fast, louder than anything else in the building, cutting through the echo of footsteps and confusion as two patrol units stopped outside the main entrance and officers rushed through the glass doors with urgency written across every movement. But before anyone could explain what had actually happened, one officer saw the man standing there holding the object he had taken from the floor to prevent anyone else from touching it and shouted, "Drop it, now." The command snapped through the hallway like a door slamming shut, and every head turned toward the same place at once as Marcus Reed slowly lowered his hands exactly the way someone does when he understands the weight of the moment better than anyone else in the room. And nearby witnesses immediately started speaking at the same time, voices overlapping, desperate to correct what they thought was about to become a terrible mistake, because several of them had seen what he had just done and none of them expected what happened next. Officer Daniel Mercer moved forward quickly, his boots striking the tile with sharp authority as he closed the distance between himself and Marcus, ignoring the raised voices around him, ignoring the woman who tried to step forward to explain, ignoring the man pointing toward the corridor behind them where security guards were already securing the area, because Mercer's attention had locked onto one thing only, and within seconds his hand was already reaching for the cuffs on his belt, while Marcus remained completely still, his expression calm in a way that made some of the witnesses hesitate mid-sentence, as if they suddenly sensed something deeper unfolding beneath the surface of the moment. "Turn around," Mercer ordered, his tone carrying the certainty of someone convinced he already understood the situation. And even though several people nearby immediately protested, even though one voice clearly shouted, he stopped him. Mercer didn't slow down long enough to listen as the metal clicked shut around Marcus Reed's wrists in front of dozens of stunned onlookers, whose confusion began turning into disbelief almost instantly. A young woman near the escalator stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined as she pointed back toward the secured corridor and said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Officer, you've got the wrong person." But Mercer didn't respond, didn't even look in her direction, because in his mind the scene had already been decided before anyone finished explaining it. And as more phones lifted into the air to record what was happening, Marcus finally spoke for the first time, his voice low, controlled, and strangely calm for someone being surrounded by flashing lights and raised voices. "Officer," he said quietly, not resisting, not arguing, not even raising his head, "you just made a mistake you can't undo." And for a brief second that no one in the crowd could quite explain later, the hallway fell silent, as if something larger than the arrest itself had just entered the room, something none of them understood yet, something Officer Mercer clearly didn't recognize at all. Emily Carter did not stop walking forward even when Officer Daniel Mercer raised one hand toward her as a warning to stay back, because what she had just witnessed minutes earlier was still replaying in her mind with a clarity that made silence feel impossible, and her voice rose above the murmurs spreading through the corridor as she pointed toward Marcus Reed and said again, louder this time, "He protected us. He stopped everything before anyone else even knew what was happening." But Mercer barely turned his head in her direction as if her words were background noise instead of testimony that could change everything. And that was the moment the crowd began to shift, not physically at first, but emotionally, because several people who had been unsure suddenly realized they had seen the same thing she had seen, and their hesitation started turning into confidence. A man near the storefront raised his phone higher and said he recorded the entire thing, while another woman stepped closer and repeated that Marcus had told everyone to move away before the alarms even started sounding. Yet Mercer's grip on procedure seemed stronger than the growing voices around him as he guided Marcus toward the center of the hallway, where two other officers were already watching carefully, waiting for instructions that had not yet been explained but were clearly being followed without question. Marcus did not resist as he walked, his shoulders steady, his steps measured, his eyes moving slowly across the faces of the people who were now speaking for him, as if he understood something they did not yet see coming. And when Mercer finally stopped near the security barrier, he spoke again, his voice firm but controlled as he asked Marcus where he had gotten the object he had picked up from the floor. Yet before Marcus could answer, Emily stepped forward once more and said it was already there before he touched it, and that he only moved it so nobody else would get hurt. But Mercer shook his head slightly, as though the explanation arrived too late to matter. Around them, the flashing red and blue reflections from outside the glass entrance stretched across the polished floor in long moving streaks that made the scene feel unreal to several of the witnesses who were now whispering to each other that something about the arrest did not make sense. And one older man quietly said he had served in the military years earlier, and that Marcus had moved like someone trained, not like someone confused or panicked, which caused another officer standing nearby to glance at Marcus for the first time with a different kind of attention, the kind that appears when uncertainty begins to replace assumption. Mercer asked again for identification, and Marcus calmly explained that his wallet was inside his jacket pocket and that he would move slowly if the officer allowed him to retrieve it. But before Marcus could reach for anything, Mercer removed the wallet himself and opened it quickly, as if expecting something ordinary, something simple, something that confirmed what he already believed. Yet the expression on his face changed almost immediately in a way that did not go unnoticed by the officers standing beside him. For a brief moment, Mercer stared at the identification card without speaking, his posture stiffening slightly as though he had expected a different answer from what he was seeing. And when one of the officers beside him quietly asked what the card said, Mercer closed the wallet halfway and replied that it did not matter yet, because they would verify everything at the station instead, even though the hesitation in his voice suggested that something about the name he had just read had already begun to complicate the situation more than he was willing to admit in front of the growing crowd. Behind them, several phones were now streaming live video across social media as witnesses described what they believed they had just watched, and inside the police radio clipped to Mercer's shoulder, a voice from dispatch began asking for confirmation of the detained individual's name again, with a tone that sounded sharper than routine procedure, sharper than normal follow-up, sharper in a way that made one of the nearby officers glance at the radio before looking back at Marcus, as if trying to decide whether the silence that followed meant something important had just started moving behind the scenes. Mercer pressed the radio button and repeated the name Marcus Reed slowly, clearly, expecting the usual confirmation response that ended most identification checks within seconds. But instead there was a pause that stretched longer than anyone expected, long enough that several officers exchanged brief looks without speaking. And then dispatch answered again in a voice that sounded quieter than before, as if someone else had stepped closer to listen on the other end of the line, and said, "Officer Mercer, please remain where you are and do not transport the individual until further instruction arrives." Officer Daniel Mercer did not like the tone in dispatch's voice because it sounded different from routine confirmation, and he had been wearing a badge long enough to recognize when something ordinary suddenly stopped being ordinary. Yet instead of acknowledging that change, he straightened his shoulders slightly and answered that he was preparing to transport the detainee unless there was a specific reason to delay. But the reply that came back over the radio was slower than before and far more careful, as dispatch repeated again that he should remain exactly where he was and wait for further instruction. And that hesitation spread quietly through the officers standing nearby, because none of them could remember the last time a simple identification check had created this kind of pause. Around them, the corridor inside Brookdale Mall no longer sounded like confusion, but like anticipation, as more witnesses gathered closer behind the temporary security barrier, and several of them continued explaining what they had seen only minutes earlier, repeating that Marcus Reed had been the one guiding people away from danger, and that he had stayed behind longer than anyone else when others were trying to get out. Yet Mercer's attention stayed fixed on the name he had just spoken into the radio because something about the response from dispatch had shifted the balance of the situation in a way he could not yet explain. One of the younger officers standing beside him leaned closer and quietly asked if everything was normal, and Mercer answered that it was just a routine verification delay, even though his voice no longer carried the certainty it had earlier. And when he reached again for Marcus's wallet to review the identification card more carefully, his eyes moved across the lettering a second time, as if expecting the information to change now that dispatch had reacted differently than expected, but the name remained the same, and the card still carried markings that did not resemble the usual identification he encountered during typical arrests. Marcus remained completely still during this moment, his posture calm and his expression unreadable as he watched the officers speaking quietly around him without interrupting or correcting them. And there was something about that silence that several witnesses began to notice because it did not look like fear or frustration, but like patience. The kind of patience people show when they already understand something others have not yet realized. Near the escalator, Emily Carter continued recording with her phone while whispering to the people beside her that something about the situation was changing even if nobody could explain why. And her voice carried just enough confidence that others nearby started paying closer attention to the officers instead of the secured corridor behind them, as though the Real story had shifted from what had happened earlier to what was happening now. Mercer pressed the radio button again and asked dispatch what the delay meant, expecting a direct answer this time. But instead a different voice responded, one that sounded older and more formal, and that voice did not identify itself immediately before asking him to confirm once more the exact spelling of the detained individual's name. And as Mercer repeated the name slowly a second time, the officer standing closest to him glanced toward Marcus again with a look that suggested the situation was no longer routine at all. The new voice on the radio paused for several seconds before speaking again, and when it did, the tone carried something heavier than simple procedure, as it instructed Mercer not to move the detainee and not to remove him from the location under any circumstances until additional personnel arrived. And this time the silence that followed spread farther than before, because even the witnesses behind the barrier sensed that something important had just changed. Mercer lowered the radio slightly and looked at Marcus with a different expression than the one he had shown earlier. Not uncertainty exactly, but something closer to calculation, as if he were trying to understand why a name alone had caused this kind of reaction across multiple channels at once. And before he could speak again, Marcus finally lifted his head just enough to meet Mercer's eyes directly and said in the same calm voice he had used from the beginning that someone important would be arriving soon, and that it would be better for everyone if the officers waited exactly where they were. Officer Daniel Mercer had heard people say before that sometimes a situation changes without warning. But standing in the center corridor of Brookdale Mall with dozens of witnesses watching and two separate voices from dispatch already telling him to wait, he began to understand that this was one of those moments when procedure stopped feeling predictable and started feeling watched from somewhere beyond his reach. Yet instead of stepping back, he adjusted his stance slightly and spoke into the radio again with controlled confidence, asking who exactly was requesting the delay and why additional personnel were suddenly necessary for what he still believed was a straightforward detention. But the answer that came back this time did not come through the open channel at all. Instead, the radio clipped to his shoulder emitted a short tone he had almost never heard before, the signal that meant his call had been redirected to a restricted communication line, and the officer standing beside him immediately looked at the device with raised eyebrows, because even he recognized that tone as something reserved for situations that did not involve ordinary mall incidents or routine identification checks. Mercer stepped a few feet away from the crowd before responding, lowering his voice slightly as he identified himself again, and when the reply came through it was calm, formal, and unmistakably different from the local dispatch voices he had been speaking with earlier, as the new speaker asked him to confirm his exact location inside the building and then instructed him again not to transport the detained individual under any circumstances, adding that senior coordination units were already en route and would arrive shortly. Behind him, the witnesses had grown quieter than before, because even though they could not hear the conversation, they could see the shift in posture and tone that signaled something unusual was unfolding. And Emily Carter lowered her phone for the first time since she began recording as she whispered to the people near her that officers did not usually receive calls like that unless someone important was involved. Mercer ended the restricted transmission without receiving any explanation that satisfied him and returned toward Marcus Reed with a look that was no longer confident in the same way it had been earlier. And one of the other officers quietly asked if they should begin preparing transport anyway, just in case the delay turned out to be unnecessary. But Mercer shook his head once as if calculating the risk of moving too quickly now that multiple instructions had arrived from outside their department. Marcus remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, calm and steady despite the flashing lights reflecting across the polished floor and the steady attention of every person still gathered behind the barrier. And when Mercer looked at him again this time, there was a brief pause before he spoke, as though he were deciding whether to ask the question that had been forming in his mind since the restricted channel opened. Instead of asking directly, he studied the identification card once more, and then looked back up at Marcus with narrowed focus, as if searching for confirmation that the name alone could explain the unusual response from dispatch. Yet Marcus did not offer clarification or explanation, and simply stood there with the same quiet composure he had shown since the first moment the cuffs were placed around his wrists. Outside the main entrance of the mall, the sound of approaching vehicles began to echo faintly through the glass panels as more emergency units arrived to secure the perimeter. But one of the officers near the doorway suddenly noticed something else approaching from the far side of the parking lot, something that did not resemble the usual patrol vehicles that had arrived earlier. And he leaned slightly toward Mercer before saying in a careful voice that several dark government vehicles were entering the lot together at the same time. Mercer turned his head toward the entrance just long enough to see the reflection of those vehicles moving closer through the glass before looking back at Marcus again with a different expression than before, one shaped less by certainty and more by the realization that whatever response dispatch had been preparing was already pulling into the building faster than he expected. The first thing Officer Daniel Mercer noticed was that the vehicles did not stop where regular patrol units usually parked, because instead of pulling up near the main entrance like the others had done earlier, they formed a quiet line along the outer lane of the parking lot, as if positioning themselves with purpose rather than urgency. And that difference alone was enough to make the officers standing near the glass doors exchange brief looks that said more than any radio message could explain. One of the younger officers stepped closer to the entrance for a better view, and then returned with a slower walk than before, speaking carefully as he told Mercer that the vehicles did not carry local department markings, and that none of them appeared to belong to the county units that normally assisted during large incidents, which created a silence that spread across the corridor, because even the witnesses behind the barrier sensed that something unfamiliar had just arrived. Emily Carter raised her phone again, but this time she was not recording Marcus Reed or the officers around him. She was recording the entrance itself, as several dark vehicles stopped in near perfect alignment outside the glass and remained still for a few seconds longer than expected before any doors opened. And that pause carried a weight that made people stop whispering entirely. Mercer kept his posture firm as he watched the reflection of those vehicles in the polished floor near the entrance. Yet inside, he could already feel the situation shifting beyond his control in ways that training alone could not fully explain, because restricted channel calls almost never arrived without follow-up, and follow-up almost never arrived this quickly. One of the officers beside him quietly asked whether they should contact the station commander before the new arrivals entered the building. But Mercer shook his head once and answered that dispatch already knew everything they needed to know, even though the certainty he had spoken with earlier was no longer present in his voice the way it had been before the restricted transmission interrupted routine communication. Marcus remained exactly where he had been standing from the beginning, calm and steady despite the growing attention around him. And when the first vehicle door outside finally opened, the movement drew every eye in the corridor toward the entrance, as if the building itself had shifted its focus in the same direction at once. A tall man stepped out first, wearing a dark jacket without visible insignia, and walking with the kind of quiet confidence that did not ask permission to enter any space. And behind him 2 others followed with the same measured pace, their attention already scanning the interior through the glass before they even reached the doors. The officers near the entrance instinctively straightened as the group approached, not because they had been given instructions to do so, but because something about the presence of the arriving personnel suggested authority that did not need to be announced aloud. Mercer watched them carefully as they crossed the threshold into the building and began walking directly toward the secured corridor without hesitation. And when the lead man reached the temporary barrier, he spoke briefly with one of the perimeter officers before his attention shifted immediately toward Marcus Reed, as if he had already known exactly where to look before stepping inside. The crowd behind the barrier grew completely silent as the man moved forward with deliberate calm, stopping only a few feet away from Mercer and studying the situation for a moment longer than anyone expected before asking a single quiet question that carried far more weight than its volume suggested, as he said which officer placed the cuffs on him. And although the words were simple, the tone behind them made it clear to everyone standing nearby that the answer was about to matter far more than Officer Daniel Mercer had ever anticipated when he first stepped through the mall entrance earlier that afternoon. Officer Daniel Mercer did not answer immediately because the question sounded simple, but carried a weight that made every officer within earshot understand that this moment was no longer about what had happened earlier in the mall, but about what was happening now. And for the first time since placing the cuffs on Marcus Reed, he hesitated just long enough for the silence to stretch across the corridor before finally saying that he had ordered the detention himself based on what he believed to be probable cause at the scene. The man who had asked the question listened without interrupting and then nodded once as though confirming something already expected rather than something newly discovered. And when he stepped closer, the officers standing nearby shifted slightly to make room without being asked because his presence carried the kind of authority that did not require explanation. Emily Carter watched carefully from behind the barrier as the man reached into his jacket and produced identification that he showed only briefly to Mercer before lowering it again. Yet even from a distance, the reaction on Mercer's face was enough for several witnesses to realize that whatever credentials had just been presented were not local and not routine. The man introduced himself calmly as Colonel Nathan Brooks, and his voice remained steady as he repeated the same question once more, asking again which officer had placed the cuffs on Marcus Reed, and this time Mercer answered without hesitation that he had done so personally. Colonel Brooks studied him for a moment longer than expected, as though measuring the meaning behind that answer before turning his attention toward Marcus, whose posture had not changed since the beginning of the encounter, and the contrast between the two men standing only a few feet apart was clear even to the witnesses who did not yet understand what role either of them played in what was unfolding. One of the officers near the entrance quietly asked whether the situation should now be transferred to federal jurisdiction, but Colonel Brooks did not respond immediately and instead stepped closer to Marcus and spoke to him in a tone that sounded less like an introduction and more like confirmation as he asked if everything had remained secure since the earlier incident inside the corridor. Marcus answered with a single calm sentence that everything had been contained before local units arrived, and that he had followed standard protective protocol once the area was clear, and that response caused two of the officers standing nearby to exchange brief glances because the phrasing did not sound like the language of someone who had simply been present by coincidence. Mercer looked from Marcus back to Colonel Brooks as though trying to connect details that had not been visible earlier, and for the first time he asked directly what authority the colonel represented and why his arrival had been coordinated so quickly after the identification check reached dispatch. Colonel Brooks turned his attention back to Mercer with a steady expression that did not carry anger or urgency, but something far more controlled as he explained that the detained individual was not someone who should have been transported under local procedure and that multiple federal coordination channels had been activated the moment his name entered the system. The officers standing nearby grew noticeably quieter as they listened because none of them had expected a name alone to trigger that level of response across multiple agencies at once, and Mercer's hand shifted slightly toward the cuffs, as if considering whether to remove them immediately. Yet he paused before acting because he still had not been told exactly why the situation had changed so dramatically. Colonel Brooks watched that hesitation carefully before speaking again in the same calm voice he had used from the moment he entered the building, and said that there was one detail Officer Mercer needed to understand before making his next decision. And as every person within the secured corridor leaned forward slightly to hear what he would say next, he looked directly at Mercer and asked if he had any idea who Marcus Reed really was. Officer Daniel Mercer did not answer Colonel Nathan Brooks immediately because the question did not sound like a request for identification anymore, but like a final chance to understand something he should have recognized earlier. And for the first time since the encounter began inside the mall corridor, he realized that the silence surrounding Marcus Reed was not uncertainty, but restraint. The kind of restraint that exists when information is being held back for reasons larger than the scene in front of him. Mercer finally said that the identification card listed Marcus Reed as attached to a federal coordination unit, but that the markings were not standard issue and had not matched anything in the local system. And as soon as he finished speaking, several officers nearby leaned slightly closer without meaning to, because they sensed the explanation they were about to hear would change everything they thought they understood about the last 15 minutes. Colonel Brooks nodded once as though confirming that Mercer had at least noticed part of what he should have noticed, and then he turned slightly, so that both Mercer and the officers standing beside him could hear clearly when he spoke again in the same calm voice he had used since stepping inside the building. He said that the identification card Mercer had reviewed was never intended to pass through routine verification channels, and that the reason dispatch had redirected the communication line earlier was because the name Marcus Reed did not belong inside the same system used for standard arrests or civilian processing. One of the younger officers near the entrance glanced again toward Marcus with a completely different expression than before, as if he were now seeing the same quiet posture in a new way. And Emily Carter lowered her phone slowly, because even she could sense that whatever was about to be said next would explain why the restricted channel had opened so quickly after the name was spoken. Mercer asked directly what unit Marcus Reed was assigned to and why multiple coordination teams had arrived within minutes of the identification check. And Colonel Brooks studied him carefully for a moment before answering, as though making sure every person inside the secured corridor understood the significance of the response. He said that Marcus Reed was not attached to a standard federal division and that his presence inside the mall earlier that afternoon had not been accidental or unrelated to the events that had just taken place in the corridor behind them, and the tone of his voice changed slightly as he added that the situation Mercer believed had ended before local units arrived had in fact already been under observation before anyone inside the building realized something was wrong. Several officers exchanged brief looks at that statement because it suggested the earlier incident had been part of something larger than a spontaneous emergency, and Mercer's hand shifted again near the cuffs as if the realization was beginning to reach him piece by piece. Colonel Brooks then looked directly at him and spoke clearly enough that every witness standing behind the barrier could hear the words even though they did not fully understand them yet, as he said that Marcus Reed was assigned to Delta Force, and that the operation he had just helped stabilize inside the mall had been classified long before the first alarm sounded. The silence that followed spread across the corridor so completely that even the officers near the entrance stopped moving for a moment, and Mercer stared at Marcus as though the calm expression he had seen from the beginning suddenly carried a meaning he should have recognized much earlier. Yet before he could respond, Colonel Brooks added one more sentence in the same steady voice, as he explained that placing restraints on Marcus Reed during an active classified response had triggered an automatic federal review process that was already moving faster than anyone in the building had expected. For several seconds after Colonel Nathan Brooks spoke the words Delta Force, no one inside the secured corridor moved at all, because the meaning of that name did not settle immediately like ordinary information, but spread slowly across the room as realization replaced assumption one person at a time. And Officer Daniel Mercer felt that change before he fully understood it, because the silence around him no longer felt like confusion from witnesses, but like attention from people who suddenly recognized that the situation had crossed into territory far beyond routine local authority. Mercer looked again at the cuffs around Marcus Reed's wrists, and this time his hesitation was not uncertainty, but calculation, because every officer present understood that a classified assignment was not something mentioned casually inside a crowded mall corridor unless the circumstances required immediate clarity. And Colonel Brooks watched that moment carefully without raising his voice or repeating himself, because the message had already been delivered exactly the way it needed to be delivered. One of the officers near the entrance quietly asked whether they should remove the restraints immediately, and the question itself seemed to shift the air inside the corridor because it acknowledged openly what several of them had already begun to understand. Yet Colonel Brooks did not answer right away and instead reached for a secure communication device, clipped inside his jacket, as if confirming that additional coordination had already begun moving through channels no one else in the building could access. Marcus Reed remained calm exactly as he had been from the beginning of the encounter, and when Colonel Brooks finally turned toward him again, he spoke with the same measured tone as before and said that the perimeter units had confirmed the area was secure and that federal review teams were already preparing documentation regarding the interruption that had occurred during the earlier response inside the mall. Several witnesses behind the barrier exchanged quiet whispers, because even though they did not fully understand the meaning of federal review, they understood the weight of those words and the way officers around them were now standing differently than before, as if the entire situation had shifted direction without warning. Mercer asked what the review process involved and whether it would remain internal to federal coordination or extend to local procedure, and Colonel Brooks answered that the process had already been initiated automatically once Marcus Reed's name entered the restricted channel earlier, and that body camera footage from the entire encounter was already being preserved under federal evidence protocol, which caused two of the officers beside Mercer to glance at each other with expressions that suggested they now understood why dispatch had insisted no transport take place earlier. Emily Carter lowered her phone completely as she watched Mercer look again toward Marcus, because the confidence that had shaped his actions earlier had clearly changed into something more careful and more controlled as he considered what would happen next. And before Mercer could speak again, Colonel Brooks continued calmly by explaining that the Federal Coordination Office had already notified the department command structure that an external review team would be arriving within the hour to collect statements from everyone present during the detention. The officers standing nearby listened without interrupting because none of them had expected the situation to expand beyond the mall corridor when they first arrived earlier that afternoon, and Mercer finally reached forward with deliberate care and removed the restraints from Marcus Reed's wrists without speaking, as if understanding that the decision no longer belonged to him alone. Colonel Brooks watched that action closely and then nodded once before explaining that the review process would now determine how the interruption of a classified response had occurred and whether procedural authority had been exceeded during the initial detention. And as the witnesses behind the barrier slowly began to realize that the encounter they had recorded only minutes earlier had already become part of a federal investigation, Mercer understood that the consequences of what had happened inside the corridor were only beginning to unfold. 3 months later, the courtroom in downtown Brookdale was quieter than anyone expected for a case that had already been watched by thousands of people online, because the hallway outside still carried the echo of reporters speaking in low voices, while inside the courtroom the atmosphere felt controlled and deliberate, as if everyone present understood that what was being decided that morning was not only about one officer's decision inside a shopping mall corridor, but about something much larger than a single afternoon encounter. Officer Daniel Mercer sat at the defense table with his hands folded carefully in front of him in a posture that looked very different from the confident stance he had carried the day he first stepped through the glass entrance of Brookdale Mall. And although he had reviewed the body camera footage many times since that afternoon, the sequence of events had not become easier to explain, because each replay showed the same moment when dispatch told him to wait and the same decision he made to continue forward without understanding the consequences that had already begun moving around him. Across the courtroom, Marcus Reed sat quietly beside Colonel Nathan Brooks without drawing attention to himself, even though several observers recognized him from the recordings that had spread across national news networks after the federal review confirmed that his presence inside the mall had been part of a coordinated response already in motion before local units arrived. And the contrast between the calm way he carried himself now and the attention surrounding the case made several people in the courtroom look at him with a kind of respect they had not fully understood the first time they saw him standing behind temporary barriers with restraints around his wrists. When the judge entered the room, the conversation stopped immediately, and the proceedings began with a summary of the federal coordination findings that explained how restricted communication channels had been activated the moment Marcus Reed's identification entered the system, and how instructions had been issued clearly to prevent any transport until the situation could be reviewed by senior coordination personnel already moving toward the location at the time. The courtroom remained completely still as the judge continued explaining that body camera recordings and dispatch transcripts confirmed those instructions had been delivered more than once before the detention continued, and that those details formed the basis of the review that followed. And several officers seated in the gallery lowered their eyes as they listened because they recognized how quickly an ordinary decision can become something permanent once it crosses into federal jurisdiction. Officer Mercer listened without interruption as the final portion of the ruling explained that interfering with a classified response while ignoring restricted channel instructions created consequences that extended beyond departmental procedure and required accountability under federal law designed to protect active coordination operations already underway before local arrival. And although the courtroom remained quiet, the meaning of those words reached every person present at the same moment. When the judge finished reading the sentence, the room stayed silent for several seconds longer than expected because the number announced carried weight not only as punishment, but as a reminder of how quickly authority can change direction when information is overlooked in the middle of uncertainty. And as the hearing concluded, Marcus Reed stood calmly beside Colonel Nathan Brooks, without speaking, while officers escorted Daniel Mercer from the courtroom with the same steady professionalism he himself had shown earlier that afternoon months before. As people began leaving the courtroom, Emily Carter remained seated near the back for a moment longer than anyone else, because she remembered clearly the moment inside the mall corridor when she first raised her phone to explain that Marcus had protected everyone near her. And as she finally stood to leave, she realized that the quiet man who had not argued or resisted that afternoon had never needed to explain himself at all, because the truth had already been moving toward the room long before anyone else understood what they were witnessing.